Hey folks, Dave here, and welcome to a special one-off video that I guess is basically arts and crafts with Ranger Dave. For those of you that were around during the Fallout 4 settlement tour heyday, this video is probably going to be right up your alley. Quite a few people who have dropped by to, well, play with the train set have pointed out that it's actually really hard to tell how small it really is just by the photos in the video. So this is how big it is compared to me. This is one of the locomotives here. This is one of the boxcars. And this is a in-scale truck. This is all in scale, which is 1 inch equals 160 inches in real life. And as you guys can see, it's absolutely tiny, but it's actually a lot of fun to work in a scale this small because you can pack in a ton of detail in a really small space. The inspiration for this project came from both my son's absolute love of all things trains and all the model trains that he got to see on vacation last year, visiting a railroad museum up in Pennsylvania. He got to ride a live, real Thomas the Tank Engine and some other steam engines, and he got to see just tons and tons of really detailed model train sets. But also, when I was a kid, my dad built me a model train set. I was maybe 4 years old at the time, and I played with that thing for so many years, making my own scenery and modifying buildings and tracks. And I think for me, that's where a lot of the creativity that I have came from, and my love for all things environment art and modding, things like the Fallout 4 settlements. It came from my time with that train set as a kid, and I wanted that same experience for my son, Micah, even though he's just barely 3 years old.
Huh? What? Huh? What you looking at?
But before I break down how I built this thing and how, again, it almost killed me, let's give you guys a tour of all the locations on this train set. Up front, right next to the controller, we have a grade crossing with working crossing arms and working flashing lights. Down the road from there, there's a auto body shop with work lights inside and a broken down bus and some stranded passengers. Behind the auto shop, there is a small frozen pond with a canoe. And then up the driveway from the auto shop is a snowed-in house on the hill, complete with a snowman. Behind the house and over a small ravine is the large tunnel that towers over the town. Small pine trees dot the top, and the source of our river begins in the ravine just below the house on the hill. The tunnel opens up on the other side with a larger tunnel portal, which leads to a small bridge with a blinking light over the river. Just upstream past the bridge, at the river's edge, is a small hunting cabin with a lamppost out in the woods. The path to get out to the cabin is partially hidden in this very thick forest with this snowy trail, complete with some fallen logs. Once you get past the blinking railroad bridge, you come to the small town with a traffic circle and a Christmas tree right in the center. The town is made up of two 1920s Sears catalog style houses, a small country church, and a general store. The church even has a real brass bell up there in the bell tower, and a pastor welcoming the congregation next to the bulldozer that helped clear out the snow. Just behind the town is the dead forest, full of wintertime trees, with a ravine cutting through it where the railroad main line goes. In the very center of the layout, where I once had a tree stand for the Christmas tree, there is now a gently sloping snow-covered hill. As you exit the dead forest and head back towards the front of the layout with the controller, you'll come to our railroad yard here with a number of accessory sheds and buildings, an oil tanker filling up the propane tank there, as well as a rather ramshackle and old engine shed with 2 tracks inside. The wooden doors are long gone, and the roof has partially collapsed and has been partially repaired, but this shed is still busy with workers working to maintain what I see in my head as probably some kind of Christmas tourist railroad. As you can tell from the poster inside, much like the boy from the Polar Express, these guys still believe in Santa Claus. Past the engine shed, we have a water tower for servicing the steam engines, some additional workshops along the side of the rail yard, and a parking lot for the main station here, which is bustling with holiday travelers. There are all kinds of working lights here, including this very old incandescent clock to help our passengers know when the next train is going to arrive. All over the layout, there are all kinds of small Easter eggs and details hidden away to be discovered, including Santa Claus handing out some gifts in front of the general store. There's also a number of animals, including some caribou, or reindeer, at various spots around the layout, watching out for the trains as they go by, and there's even 6 black bears and some cubs hidden at various points all over the mountains. Be careful if you go hiking around this town. There's also several snowmans hidden away, and 3 hikers going for some wintertime adventuring. Some of them do have a bad habit of trespassing just a bit though. The entire layout is wired with, I think, close to 70 LED and incandescent small detail lights. I wanted this thing to be viewable in bright light or in the pitch black darkness, giving it a full detailed nighttime effect. Especially with all the snow built up, it just looks extra peaceful in the dark. All of the buildings have full interior lighting as well, and some even have custom decals to decorate the windows. The 12-volt DC power source for this layout is run through a simple decorative toggle switch, which then feeds into a 3-way on-on-on toggle switch, which controls the 3 signal lights.
Green. Yellow, egg. Yellow, egg.
Seeing this is just a fun oval layout, all the signal lights are linked together using T-splits on the wires. And here it is in the daylight. I still haven't actually come up with a name for this town just yet. I was too busy trying to get it finished in time for Christmas to come up with any good ideas, but Micah just calls this the North Pole because of that giant Christmas tree in the center of the town. I hope you all enjoyed that little tour of the train set. Now let's dive in and you can join my descent into madness and see how I built this thing. This is how it all began. A basic Bachmann in-scale Christmas train set. It came with a simple loop, 1 power pack, 1 engine, and 3 cars. It wasn't too expensive, and I figured if it got banged up a bit, after all, my son is only 3, well, we at least had some fun with it around the tree for Christmas. Then I found this 1980s Christmas observation car on eBay for about 20 bucks shipped, and the journey down the rabbit hole began. Still though, in the beginning, I just wanted a couple extra cars to make the train look nice. There's no sound effects or anything, just a basic oval around the tree. Then I got to thinking, okay, we gotta add some spice to it, right? Even if it's just a train doing an oval around the tree, we gotta have a crossing. And then I also picked up a bargain bin set of Christmas Village buildings from Amazon for like 18 bucks shipped, along with a nice big wooden train Brio signal. This thing is pretty cool. I figured that way Micah could control the signal lights himself, even though the train was going to be under the tree. You can really see me struggling here to try to keep this thing down to earth. Basic buildings, a basic oval, and then I started buying pink foam. I wanted to add a tunnel, and my initial plan here, as you can see, was to add a base onto the tunnel so that I could just place it onto a piece of plywood or in the floor under the tree, and it would just be kind of a standalone tunnel. You could just pick it up and put it away at the end of the year. But the more I looked at the tunnel plan, the more I thought, what if I just put the tunnel and all of the track down on a piece of plywood and mounted the Christmas tree right to it? Then I can add more scenery, I can secure the track down with some nails, and that is where the Amazon ordering began. I picked up tunnel portals, a bunch of different in-scale trees of all types, a blinking bridge with a red light, and even some string fairy lights to run around the edge of the plywood to help brighten up underneath the Christmas tree where I wanted this thing to run. This would be one of many orders of scenery, figures, and equipment for this project. The same week that I placed the order for all that scenery, I went all in on the engine as well. I kept looking for the rest of that Christmas car set on eBay, and I knew that this little Bachmann engine wasn't going to be able to pull a lot of those big passenger cars. And I also hadn't been able to find a good solution for sound. I really wanted Micah to have some sound effects with his Christmas train. So I went all in and bought a high-end steam engine produced by Broadway Limited Imports. This thing works on both basic DC tracks as well as DCC layouts using a full-on digital controller. And I picked a railroad that could possibly be loaning a locomotive for a North Pole run. This is a Great Northern locomotive, a heavy Mikado type. This thing is also pretty expensive. It's about twice the price of the original Bachmann train set for just the locomotive here. But it is meticulously detailed and has built-in sound effects, even if you're just using a basic DC controller to control it. That's where it's just getting power. The sound effects are mostly automatic. There's just no way to do the whistle and the bell and the stuff like that on command. To do the fancier stuff like the sound effects on command, you have to have a digital controller, and I was determined at this point to try and keep things simple and just use that basic DC controller because I knew that Micah would be able to handle that one without any issues. It's just a nice simple dial, faster, turn it to the right, slower, turn it to the left. And the sound effects actually sounded awesome, even just without being able to control the whistle and the bell. This is where the planning really kicked off, and you can see in my original track plan here that most of the things that I had in my bank of ideas did make it to the final layout. Even though I would later get rid of that giant X-shaped Christmas tree stand, there still wasn't room for some things like the couple of bridges that I wanted to add here, one at the house on the hill and one at the dead forest past the town. At the dead forest, there just wasn't enough vertical clearance to add a little wooden bridge. Wouldn't have had time to do it anyway. And then at the house on the hill, there just wasn't enough room to fit a creek in and still get some elevation for the house. This entire thing is only about 46 inches long by 27 inches wide. Not a lot of room to work with. Other details like the coaling tower or putting telephone poles all the way down the street were either going to require too much time, or in the case of the coaling tower, there just wasn't going to be a good place to put it without blocking a view of something else that was cooler. You can also see my initial plan here to run those fairy lights right along the track to help light up the engine and cars as they would go by, as I expected it to be pretty dark under the Christmas tree, but thankfully I would abandon that plan before the end and just run those fairy lights along the edge of the plywood itself for the entire layout. I also decided to make my own tree stand because the X-shaped one that came with the tree was going to take up way too much room with all these other additional detail features that I wanted to add. So I designed and built one out of a pipe system, got a pipe floor mount, floor flange, and a basic piece of 10-inch pipe from Home Depot, and that ended up being a perfect fit for a tree. A nice tight friction fit, just sliding the base of the tree right in there. The roadways were built with a very basic toy car roadway tape that I picked up also off of Amazon, and I just detailed on top of it a bit, covering up the word mark and adding some things like painting on fake asphalt patches and adding some gravel along the edges later on down the road. I figured this road tape would be on the very bottom layer of all the detailing, so the fact that it was just stickers wouldn't matter too much in the end, and I think I was right. This whole time I had been prowling eBay looking for some more in-scale buildings to help fill out the rest of the layout, but model buildings, even used ones, are really expensive. But I ran across this kind of island of misfit toys lot of some broken old model buildings that someone had taken off of someone else's layout. Kind of sad to think about, really. These were all broken and missing pieces, but knowing that I was going to cover a lot of them with snow and paint, I figured this was a nice deal. It was like $28-30 for a lot of 6 or 7 buildings, and this would give me something to work with and to fill out some details on the layout. Also from eBay, and you're going to see a trend with eBay here, I picked up some basic in-scale vehicles, including a nice blue bus, and decided to start doing some experiments with detailing some of the cars that came with the Bachmann set. I actually customized this empty coal hopper car using a piece of foam and some of the Woodland scenic cement glue to hold some ballast down, and then I was going to go ahead and paint it to look like coal. Like I mentioned earlier, I hadn't ever gone this deep for creating scenery or detailing for my model trains. You know, when I was a kid, I just bought stuff that you could open the box up and just add to a basic 4x8 layout and just play with it. You know, the basic plastic buildings and plastic trees and whatnot. So I really had no experience with this level of detail and was just kind of winging it based off of what I had seen on YouTube. But I found myself having way too much fun starting out with some of these details, like here with our coal hopper car and the ballast. Some of the elevation for the tracks was going to be tricky, as I wanted the bridge to actually have some elevation over the river, and the train would have to climb up and down the hill to and from that bridge. And I had to test constantly to make sure that our engines wouldn't be struggling on the grade to get up to that bridge. To scale, I think this is actually a pretty steep grade, definitely more than the standard 4%, I think. I hand cut the corners of the plywood with a jigsaw. It actually came out way better than I expected, and with only 33 days until Christmas there, I started adding some feet onto the bottom, expecting that I would want to leave some room for routing Christmas lights and wires and whatnot underneath. So that's what you're seeing here are the grooves that I left behind to route wires. And initially I thought that this would be enough, space off the floor with some furniture pads on it for the wires, but I was wrong. I would end up having to add a lot of spacers because the wiring would get way out of control. 32 days until Christmas, and I'm out there just after Thanksgiving priming this thing in the frigid cold. I don't have an indoor garage to work in, just an outdoor garage, so a lot of this work was done in the cold and dark as winter started to roll into our area in full force. I also picked up a Bachmann Easy Track switch because I decided I did want to actually add the engine shed onto the layout. I know that Micah loved watching the engines come and go from the engine shed when he visited a tourist railroad back in the fall. And I figured this shed came in the lot. I'll pick up a switch and make sure everything works power-wise, and we'll go ahead and just add it to the layout. You are going to see that I'll have to add an extension to make it fit well, though, onto the oval. With just 30 days until Christmas, I worked on getting the new Christmas tree mount secured to the middle of the bottom of the plywood here. I actually countersunk it with some washers and some lock nuts because, 3-year-old, he's probably going to bump into the Christmas tree at full speed at least a couple times over the Christmas holidays. So I wanted that extra pipe stand support to make sure that this thing couldn't be ripped off the plywood if it was just held by screws from above. So I did 2 screws and 2 nuts and washers through the plywood to hold that thing tight, and it actually ended up way stronger than the original Christmas tree stand. And this is where the fun really began. I skipped a bit ahead here. I didn't have a lot of footage of this. I bought a hot knife. Looks like someone murdered the Pink Panther on my side porch there. But it was great for cutting the mountain shapes, and I really had a vision in my head of how I wanted the elevation to look, and the hot knife was key to making that work because cutting insulation, pink insulation with a basic knife just makes a huge mess. So the hot knife was great for making these initial cliff shapes, with my plan being to add some plaster on top down the road. With 29 days to go until Christmas, I began fitting some of the vertical shapes together, like my initial attempt at the tunnel here, with 3 different pieces of foam stacked up. As far as the tunnel portals go, I used a single track portal on one side and a double track portal on the other. I figured that the double track portal would let me get a hook in there if a train derailed in the middle of the tunnel. A lot of times, model railroads are going to have the side of the tunnel open. But because this was going to go under the tree, it might be seen from any direction if I were to rotate it in the future. I didn't want a big access portal, just a giant hole in the side of the tunnel. With the base priming complete, it was time to start adding the snow fabric. My initial plan here was to use mostly snow fabric for the open terrain snow, just as filler, but I'll explain a bit later in the video why that actually went horribly wrong, and there's almost no snow fabric left on this project here at the end. Here you can see my much more successful second attempt at cutting out a foam shape for the tunnel. That first version with the stacked shapes was going to be too weak and too loose to plaster over, but here I've glued 3 layers of pink foam together before cutting the middle of the tunnel out. This was much stronger and got me much more vertical climb to the ridgeline, which I really wanted. All this would need would be a pink foam cap on top and then a layer of plaster over the whole thing. Here's our first plaster going down. I hadn't used plaster of Paris since I was in middle school, I think. I had truly no idea what I was doing. I just went for it. And it came out okay, but man, you've got to put that stuff down quick before it dries. I was tearing up paintbrushes and plaster of Paris cups trying to get this stuff onto the layout before it dried. You can also see a new diesel engine there, not actually new. It's an old one I picked up off of eBay, specifically because it has a lot of pulling power, but has no sound effects, because I realized I've got to keep testing the track. The snow fabric messes with the elevation, and I've got to make sure that everything is still running electrically, which is really complicated actually for a model railroad. It's very easy to get dead spots, but I couldn't run that nice steam engine with all the sound effects during the day if I wanted to test things out, because Micah would hear me in the office running a train. So I got that diesel for testing there. With 27 days until Christmas, I was cutting out a lot of the detail areas out of that snow fabric. I stapled it down to help hold it with some glue, but the more detail areas that I decided to add, I had to actually cut some of it up, which was awful. I had to scrape it with scissors and a knife. Snow fabric does not cut well. But I kept realizing that things weren't going to sit well on top of that snow fabric. So wherever I wanted to have some more immersive details, not just the white snow fabric, I ended up just cutting it out of the way. Here, you can see the big village section going down right there. I'm about to get glued down with some basic wood glue, which actually works great with pink foam. But in the middle of all of this work on the project, we were doing all of the usual Christmas traditions like family dinners and early Christmas gift exchanges, but also a few traditions of our own. In one case, we actually traveled and visited a museum and rode a Christmas train, just a diesel, but they had a huge model railroad set up, and I felt so justified here with how out of control my project had gotten for Micah's Christmas train, just looking at how excited he was for these train sets. He's wearing his engineer cap. He woke up that morning so excited. He got to push the buttons to start the train here at the museum. He spent probably an hour and a half in here just running around from layout to layout and setup to setup, just amazed by these trains. And back in my head, I'm thinking the whole time, oh man, like he is going to pass out Christmas morning if he's got his own, Polar Express underneath his Christmas tree. They even had a little small layout with some HO scale Thomas trains and some old unused scenery where the kids could control the trains with the controller. And watching him actually take that controller and control the trains carefully on his own, that was the part that really made my day, because I'm like, this is what started the whole thing, was the idea of him actually being able to use that controller even at 3 years old on his own, and he did great with it on their sample layout. So just a fun day out at the museum. Got a lot of inspiration looking at what other people had done, and when we got home, I was finally ready to dive back in and get some work done on his train. That night, I grabbed my gloves and got to work on a lot of the heavy plastering that had to be done along the track line, the river, and the tunnel. There's not a lot of footage of this because my hands were super dirty, but here you can see the initial plaster going down inside of the tunnel and on the outside of the tunnel walls. Once that initial plaster was down for the river crossing banks and the river itself, as well as the outside of the tunnel, I turned my attention to the painting. I also had a limited selection of colors, so a lot of what you see here is actually mixed from different shades that I had on hand from my wife's collection of acrylic paints. And that's how I got some of these really cool, almost purple browns for some of the rocks, and these teal and dark teal colors for the river. It's actually a very icy color that came about just from me mixing what I had together and seeing what I could come up with. I don't think I could actually replicate these colors again if I tried, but thankfully I mixed up a pretty big batch because I loved how these colors came out. They just really kind of complement and gave the whole thing a really unique look that I don't think I could have gotten with off-the-shelf paints. I really had no rhyme or reason for how much plaster I would add on top of the foam, but a thin layer for the most part did the trick. And using that pink foam as a base gave the plaster a great structural base without being super heavy. It worked out really well to layer it like that. As you can see, I've also detailed the entire interior of the tunnel because I ran 2 LED spotlights through the base at this point with the intention to add just a bit of backlighting to the tunnel so it wouldn't be pitch black inside. Tunnels are usually lit in some way. So to get that interior rock effect, I actually made basically a custom plaster mixture with my plaster of Paris powder and some copy paper. Saw this on a different YouTube video, a pretty cool method. You just crinkle the copy paper up, it's pretty thick, it makes a decent rock texture, dip it in plaster, and lay it over your tunnel walls. I can't remember where I saw that, but it worked out great. Just required a bunch of extra work, of course, for just a little payoff, where now if you look into the end of the tunnel, you can actually see some details in there. Also, check out that extra re-railer track that I stuck inside the middle of the tunnel. Again, I was worried about the possibility of trains derailing in the middle of the tunnel with no access portal to actually get in there and fix it. So to help prevent that, I stuck that re-railer track right in the middle, and I think that really has helped. I've seen a couple of derailments happen in the edges and ends of the tunnel that have been fixed by that re-railer track. And I think if I had to pinpoint a point in this whole project where I made the left-hand turn from this is going to be a under the tree Christmas set to, okay, we're going to aim for more photorealistic here, it was this point. Just because the initial foam layers for the terrain, the tunnel plaster, the initial painting, the plaster for the village and the house on the hill, the riverbed painting, just following those few tips and tricks that I had picked up from watching other YouTube channels was giving me results that I just was not expecting. It was looking so cool, and I got so excited with how it was coming together that I made that decision to kind of double down and try and make it look as photorealistic as possible. And yeah, in the back of my mind, I'm remembering some of the layouts that Micah had gotten to see on vacation and how detailed and awesome they were. I'm going, okay, this has to live up to what he's already seen for his own personal Christmas train set. Besides the terrain and landscaping though, you'll notice that I'm testing the terrains constantly. It's very easy actually to get dead spots in this track when you're constantly covered in it with dust and glue. These are very, very tiny little trains, and I think I've done more track cleaning over the course of this project than anything else to keep things running smoothly. That being said, the modern engines have a lot of capacitors and they can actually make it over quite a few dead spots. So the fact that I did actually get occasional dead spots suggests that this track was a lot messier than I even realized over the course of the construction. Also had to constantly check the turn radius of the cars, especially in the canyon valleys and in the tunnel itself. I had to do just a bit of trimming here and there with my oscillating tool to get some clearance, and then do some repair, plaster, and painting, but for the most part, the turn radius worked out thanks to all the setup that I had done initially. That was probably the most nerve-wracking part of the main construction, though, was sealing up that tunnel after so much work, cutting the foam pieces entirely twice to get the best possible and most solid result. It was just really, really nerve-wracking to seal that all up permanently and keep on moving forward. After all, at this point, with that decision to make this thing even more realistic looking overall, it's only 18 days until Christmas. As you can see here, I'm having to use some wooden dowels and some clay to fix the grade along the side of the tracks there, and we're also casting some new rocks. Once the grade was more or less set on the side of the tracks there, I used clay to help reinforce it so it wouldn't just be floating with those wooden dowels and bits of clay. It was really tricky to get that grade right, but for the most part, trains don't struggle on it now at the end, so glad I went through and kept testing it. I also started laying out the small pond at the base of the house on the hill using some modeling clay that air dries, and then pressing some of those plaster formed rocks into the side there. And that's what our tunnel is looking like as I got ready to pour our final plaster, including some additional rock molds to press in for detail wherever I could fit them in. This is where a local hobby shop really would have been great. There really aren't any left anywhere close to me at all, so I was just blind buying a lot of these supplies from Amazon and just hoping that they would work out. And they actually did, for the most part. Woodland Scenics as a brand is a pretty safe option for most of this stuff. And that is a Woodland Scenics cast right there that I'm using. One additional happy accident, as Bob Ross would say, about putting the plaster cap on the tunnel was that I had already painted some of the rock detail onto the lower parts. And so some of these drips of plaster that flowed down from the top section as I plastered it looked like collapsing flows of snow or avalanches or just natural snow drifts coming off the mountain, which was again a happy little accident. You can see here that I've also created some basic molds to help protect the edge of the tunnel portals using that modeling clay just to catch the plaster, and then I would peel those off and fill in the gaps with some slightly more carefully dripped bits of plaster off of the paintbrush. I also created little shapes here and there with some of the broken bits of the rock molds, and then used a few of those really big mold pieces to create some of the big cliff shapes. Looking at how well those were turning out, I decided to do the same treatment for the river, which is to say, press some of these neat rock molds along the edges to add some more photorealistic detail. All of the rock mold shapes were painted with just different shades of gray and brown that I mixed up more or less on the fly, so none of these ended up being exactly the same, which was pretty cool. For the snowy rocks above the tunnel, I mostly just dry brushed them, leaving some of the white plaster behind as snow detailing. And you can also see bits of the modeling clay here and there just to help fill in some of the gaps that were left behind where the plaster couldn't reach. I would later use some of the Woodland Scenics Flex Paste to seal the edges of all those. The next day, as the clay had dried, I went ahead and painted some basic gray onto the side clay here on our slope up to the creek bridge, and then drop some of these actual rock pebbles in as some not quite ballast detail, just those large river rocks that are sometimes used to reinforce a large embankment, and then a couple of actual river stones from our front flower bed right there to add some larger boulder detail. And as always, lots and lots of fallen trees, quote unquote, taken right from our backyard. It is 17 days until Christmas here, and I'm still working on the grade there on the left of the tracks and placing all of these rocks into position. As everything is starting to dry here, I am constantly testing these final grades as I'm nailing the track down and adding this ballast and rock detail here and there, because this is getting more and more permanent. Also, time is running out. I also couldn't resist hooking up the lighting inside the tunnels to a test power source, and that paper mache effect inside the tunnel on the rock walls with the light behind it came out so cool. Love that detail. Each night as Micah would go to sleep, I would also do additional testing with the actual steam engine that was going to be used for Christmas morning, just to make sure that the steam's driver wheels wouldn't also have an issue with the grade here and there. And it would be surprising to me how often just a slight kink in the rails between the connectors will be enough to cause a wheel slip or other issue. So yeah, not to be a broken record, but non-stop testing throughout this whole process to make sure that all these tracks were operational. And this is how I set up the train set for one of my work meetings on December the 8th, it looks like. Just popped a small artificial tree into the pipe stand and ran the train around in circles, and that was quite a lot of fun. I popped some smaller in-scale trees that I had collected onto the top of the tunnel, going for a distant perspective look because the tunnel is pretty small overall. I think those small trees helped give it the illusion of being bigger than it actually is. And then I started gluing down our river rocks and getting some additional rock paint onto those, as well as onto the pond rocks. Just lots of dry brushing to add detail and leaving little bits of the white poking through as ice or snow effect. I also used some of the gray ballast to add some extra rock detail to the shorelines and underneath where the water was going to flow once I poured the artificial water effect. The effect was mostly what I was looking for, but the light gray color just stood out too much, so I went about trying to figure out a way to kind of dye, I guess, the ballast to make it match the other river rocks a bit better. The ability of this small ballast to help blend the edges of the larger rocks was really cool. It was just the color that was the issue here. And I also had some of these neat cork rocks. It's just chunks of chopped up cork that actually looks like pretty convincing rocks, just to add some additional color variety to the river details. Then I added a bit more of those natural stones right there on top. Again, just totally winging this as I go, but I knew in my head that all of this had to be 100% ready to go before I poured that water on top. I was only going to have one shot at this. I mixed up some of the scenic cement glue with a couple different shades of brown and gray paint there, and basically created my own glue dye to help color that gravel and help it blend in better with the river. And actually this worked pretty well for the most part. It took a couple of passes to get some of it dyed, but it helped it not stand out quite so much with that light gray color. As I was waiting the couple of days that I needed for that to dry, I kept working on things like ballast and gravel on the gravel driveways, just to give it a more 3D and textured look, trying to leave some slight gaps there so the paint can show through. There was a lot of waiting for glue to dry at this point, so I started working on the individual buildings from our Island of Misfit Toys collection from eBay. Here's the station, as you can see, lots of pieces missing, chips on the corners, a missing side section with a rooftop, hanging gutters, missing chimneys, dirt, dust, the whole 9 yards. This building was in really rough shape. I built a basic platform for it out of these squared off dowels that would give the station its own platform to match the tracks. Did have to add one riser piece of hobby board under that just to bring it up to the correct height of the track with the roadbed there as well. Did basically the same thing with our engine shed here. Did a piece of hobby board underneath to bring it up to the level of where the snow fabric was going to be, and then dowels for support details underneath. I was also having to think with all this detailing about how the wiring was going to go down. So I built this small platform for one of our signal lights out of modeling clay just past the bridge. It is only 15 days until Christmas, and the riverbed is looking like it is just about ready to go. I added just a couple fallen logs out of the stick collection from my backyard, and then I added way more because they looked awesome. To me, those final logs were just what this riverbed needed to look pretty ridiculously realistic. As you can also see, that dye added on top of the gravel here and there really helped to blend it with the rest of the shoreline. I even got the water tapering a bit as it heads up that canyon. I'd also done some dry brushing onto our gravel bases down next to the station platform, and had prepared things for drilling holes for all the electrical for the town, and painting down some road beds up there as well. And then it was finally time for the pour. This was so nerve-wracking. And it didn't help that it took me a while to get my workbench completely level. It was not. Lots of shims required to get the whole thing level for the pour. And then this slight cardboard dam that I created to hold back the artificial water was not nearly enough, and I lost a bunch of it dripping off the end of my workbench onto thankfully some newspaper that I put down. But I wasted a good bit of the liquid trying to keep it from pouring out the end there. This stuff has tons of surface tension even when it's freshly poured, so it took a wooden dowel to help kind of work it into all of the corners and bits of rock that are all over this pretty realistic looking riverbed. Even though I thought I had layered that water on pretty thinly, it was still taking a long time to dry. So with only 14 days left until Christmas, I got cracking on the rail bed that goes through the ravine, adding in some of the natural rock and then our ballast on top, all glued down with the Woodlands Scenic Cement. I was getting pretty confident here on my methods of layering this up top to bottom, or I guess bottom to top? Yeah, bottom to top. And then working the glue in to hold it all down without completely destroying the conductivity of the rails. The key I found here was to dry brush the ballast to get it exactly where I wanted it before hitting it with any kind of liquid or glue. That way it wasn't built up too much inside of the rail ties, although I still put it on a little too heavily for most of this layout. Could have gone with a lighter touch overall. That ravine for the track was looking pretty good, but I just kept coming back to how cool this river was looking as the water was starting to dry. Having seen how good the snow effect looked on the plaster, I got inspired here to try dry brushing some white paint onto some of the buildings, as I was also adding it to some touch-up spots on top of the tunnel. It was going to be a little bit more work, but adding these extra bits of paint on top of paint on top of paint really just adds to the natural effect and helps build up some natural looking layers to the rock and other snow effects. Then it was finally time for some flex paste. This stuff is pretty crazy. It was recommended for use by Woodland Scenics in some of their how-to videos for snow scenes as a way to build up snowbanks and other snow details. It's a very, very thick paste, and it does work really, really well for rolling some snow drifts and some deeper snow effects, but I also really liked using this for building up snow on top of some of the fallen trees and even on top of the smaller rocks here. It just builds up really nicely and adds a really cool 3D depth to the snow effect. And I knew that there was going to be the snow powder that was going to go down on top of this entire layout as the final stage. So wherever I could here with the flex paste, I tried to build out details that would look good when covered with the additional snow fluff later on. It is now only 13 days until Christmas, and that water is still drying, but looking awesome. I was completely sold here on the idea of dry brushing this snow detail onto our larger structures like the bridge here and the other buildings. So I started out with some dry brushed just acrylic white paint and then some built up snow paste for some really cool looking snow drifts all over the bridge. All while being as careful as possible to make sure that I didn't get it onto the rails themselves. Looks like a snowplow might have come through and caused the snow to build up in the trusses there. The flex paste also worked great for filling in some of the gaps that were still showing up around the end caps of the tunnel, around the tunnel portals here. And you can see I have some spillage there on the stonework of the portal from the plaster. I would have to try and clean that out as much as possible. And yes, I am even adding some little icicles. This extra clear icicle that I created was created by accident from some of those drips from the river that were dripping off of my workbench. Just grabbed one of them and stuck it right in there as an extra bit of detail. In the end, I think adding the extra white paint and then eventually the flex paste here too to all of our not so gently used buildings was the right idea. It helped them blend way better into the scene. It looks much more realistic to have some of those snow effects, and it also helped to hide some of the damage. Plus, check out the Christmas decals. Thanks, eBay. With the garage complete, it was time to head back to work on the station. It took forever to cut all of these dowels to shape, but I got them all lined up there with some basic, I think it was Elmer's glue mixed with wood glue, and got everything locked down. A little bit of super glue on the edges there to help hold the end caps on, and then again mixing up some colors just on the fly, some OD green and brown tester's paint with some water made for a really cool looking stain for our station platform. Not one to leave well enough alone, I went back to work on the bridge area once again with the flex paste, and also started bringing it down onto some of the rock detail that goes up and down both sides of the river. To be honest, the flex paste is a lot of fun to work with. It just is really, really tacky and sticky, and you can build it up pretty easily where you want it. Just expect your paintbrush to get absolutely messy as you're working with it. I got it all over myself. It would stick to everything, but it is really easy to build up snowdrifts. Just be careful what your paintbrush might drag against there. Also use the flex paste to build up some really big snowdrifts along the gravel driveway to the house on the hill to give it an effect once the snow powder is added on top, like these guys have been trying to keep their driveway plowed for days and only being partially successful with that. 12 days until Christmas, and in the other room you can hear my son is watching the Polar Express for about the 90th time so far this season, while I'm working on painting and detailing some of the rocks in the pond. As per my usual plan, I am just mixing up some colors together on the fly, some of that rose-colored brown and just a bunch of stuff mixed all together to create some brown and dark purple-ish colors, just some really cool rock and dirt colors for the rocks and the dirt border that goes around that pond. I always try to mix up a little bit of extra paint as I was doing these different colors because a few times I came very close to running out, and having mixed them up, I figured I would never be able to do the same color twice. Here I'm just trying to create a depth effect with different shades of the blue mixed on a paper plate, keeping things darker towards the deeper water at the center of the pond. With that paint mostly dry, I kept detailing around the border and started placing some of our cork rocks to give the water some depth, no pun intended, and some extra detail as it would be poured around it. I also used the same basic plan for the ballast that I did with the river, placed it down to use as small shoreline rocks, and then dyed it with some of the same leftover color and glue mixture that I had used on the full riverbed. You can actually see a bit better here how it kind of just runs through and helps dye the whole thing. Looks a bit wonky when it's wet, but it looks pretty good when it's dry. From there, it was time for some occasionally meticulously placed small actual gravel, glued down once again with the Woodland Scenics cement glue there. And then, although I wasn't doing a lot of trees for detailing yet, I wanted to have a fallen scale tree, one of the actual in-scale trees here, to go along with my broken fallen tree logs from my own backyard. There's an up-close look at some of those icicles on the small tunnel portal, and then on all of the logs and rocks along the riverbed. Also working on getting our crossing glued down with some of the road tape, and of course constantly testing the electrical to make sure this is all going to work on Christmas morning. Here's one more up-close look at the station before I started really modifying it. Tons of broken and missing pieces once again. So I built a little bit of a rolling back door out of some wooden dowels and some more of that OD green tester's paint. Really happy with how that turned out. Then I built some reinforcements for underneath the chimney holes out of clay and super glue and wooden dowels. And then I actually just quickly modeled some basic chimneys out of that modeling clay using my hobby knife to create a kind of brick effect. Basic, but especially from a distance, it looks pretty good. The next night, all of the paint and glue on our small pond had finally dried, and I was confident enough to go ahead and do that water pour, and of course it helps that this was a much smaller surface area to deal with. Once again, using that wooden dowel to work it into all of the crevices. Very, very cool looking product here with that realistic water. As that was drying, I kept working on the base painting for the rest of our gravel roads and putting down the ballast to use as gravel, trying to keep things flat for the building, but also having little bits of rough spots here and there to simulate a well-used parking lot. And don't those snowdrifts on the side of the gravel driveway look pretty cool as they dried? I also used that gravel to hide the plastic base of the water tower and help it blend in with the rest of the parking lot next to the station. As all of that was drying on the main layout, I went back to work on our buildings once again, adding some snow dry brushing to the station to help hide some of those gaps, and just to help the building blend better overall into the layout. For the station, I used mostly just the acrylic paint, not a whole lot of the flex paste until, as you'll see later on, once it's actually glued into place. I think the acrylic paint and the snow dry brushing really helped the shed here, the engine shed. It looked very plasticky and fake before, even with all this dust built up from the previous owner on the rooftop. But adding bits of the acrylic paint here and there just helped to make the building look weathered and icy and just hide some of that fake plastic look. Pretty cool. Also ended up doing just a bit of the snow detailing onto our station platform as well before it was time to glue it down. I kept following the same methods for the rest of the track roadbed coming out of the tunnel and heading towards the crossing. A layer of the actual stone down first, and then quite a bit of the ballast glued down with the scenic cement to make a more realistic looking track bed. This part right here created a bunch of dead spots by accident. I think I just put way too much glue on top of this, but there's a couple of points where I was really worried that I had done something really wrong and broken the conductivity of the track here. But it worked out in the end. Moment of truth. It's finally time to start gluing down with way too much wood glue the first bits of our building bases. Gotta make sure this lines up exactly where I want it and still leaves enough room for some detailing with some vehicles and pedestrians, some little figures on top of that. Also, gotta make sure that the longer cars can clear this platform without getting caught. That would have been awful if I'd accidentally blocked the track. Also at this point, I am ordering from eBay once again. Picked up some of these cool looking little in-scale benches to help really sell the platform. Not bad for some used buildings and scratch-made parts. I realized that the platform looked really odd without any kind of ramp or stair up to it, so I created some really basic stairs using my X-Acto knife here and the modeling clay. Just pressed some steps into them using one of the wooden dowels, and then I'll be painting the whole things gray just to help make them blend in a bit better. I also used some of these little railings that came with the crossing that I wasn't going to use. They were originally supposed to be for a Japanese style crossing, so for my American crossing, wasn't going to use them. It's a more rural setting, so it didn't quite fit. So instead of using those railings on the crossing, I made a great little railing set for the station platform there. And with that, I snuck the entire layout out my office window to some sawhorses outside to begin drilling like crazy for all of the electrical work. We're almost at 10 days out from Christmas at this point, but thankfully I had a bunch of vacation days saved up from work that I had to use. So this day in particular, I think I spent almost the entire day when I wasn't helping to feed or watch Micah working on this train set, dragging it in and out the window, onto the sawhorses, drilling, vacuuming, cutting snow fabric, testing, drilling more. This was a really messy stage, but glad that I pulled it outside to do most of the drilling. I also realized that some of my wires were going to be punching through the layout and into the lowered legs of the layout. So I used my oscillating tool here to cut little channels to run the wires out the side of these legs. You can also see here that wherever I had to drill or cut, I had to cut away that stupid snow fabric first. That stuff got caught in the drill bits. It caused the tracks to float awkwardly. The more and more that I added detail-wise to this project, the more and more of that fluffy snow fabric I cut out and got rid of just because it was so awful to work around. The lighting for the signal lights used the tiniest wires that I have ever seen. It had to be 30 plus gauge. They were like little strands of human hair. So I picked up these big strands of LED wire from Home Depot so that I could immediately convert those tiny little wires over to something a little bit more substantial to actually work with. This was the moment that I decided to axe those cheap Amazon Christmas buildings though. They look pretty good on their own, but compared to the other more realistic in-scale model stuff, they just stood out way, way too much. So at this point, I decided to go ahead and order some more actual in-scale buildings to replace them, which was going to require building them myself. And I think it was that decision that almost killed me right there. I bought building kits, not finished buildings, and I still had to prepare the site for these buildings, get it flatter and smoother, and then I'm going to have to build several of these buildings piece by piece. So I started sanding down the town area to get it flatter and smoother, and then I also got to work with the flex paste once again, putting it down on top of the snow fabric wherever I was going to have to drill trees, because I finally realized that the snow fabric is just really going to have to be for the very edge of the layout. It'll be used as basically a bumper and not much else. I really just resigned myself that wherever I wanted to add a lot of detail or drill through the plywood, I was going to have to add flex paste or plaster, because the snow fabric just gets caught in drill bits and turns into a stringy mess. Anywhere that I tried to cut it, it just turned into a disaster. So as you can see here, I'm putting the flex paste wherever a lamppost is going to get drilled, and I'm also using the flex paste to seal up the edges of where I have cut the snow fabric to help keep it adhered to the base plywood. That worked pretty well, and it actually looked like snowbanks. As all of that flex paste dried with only 9 days until Christmas, some of the new buildings began arriving. I ordered this really cool looking 3D printed log cabin, which I decided to put along the river. And I had the idea to create some shrubbery here with our just Woodland Scenics spongy green foliage, basically. It's meant for making your own trees, but here I'm just clumping it up and adding a little bit of the snow powder on top to see how it looks. And I think it actually looks really great at in scale. It actually looks like clusters of forest, bushes, and underbrush. I also wanted the garage here to have some nice big spotlights, like working style lights, out the front doors and out this cool looking back window, but I realized that the plastic was too thin and there was a lot of light bleed, so I had to paint a lot of the interiors of these buildings black to help with that light bleed. Some of these LEDs were going to be too bright, so I used some plastic dividers to create filters to help diffuse that light out just a bit. Also picked up some very nice looking 3D printed fences here. I actually remember taking this clip right here and going, have I truly lost my mind? I'm painting little wooden pallets for the station and the auto shop and this little cabin for the woods. Like, this has just gone too far. On the electrical side of things, I had a frustrating issue where once all of the track was nailed and soldered down, and of course it's permanent basically at that point, I kept getting weird dead spots in and around my switch here. Sometimes an engine could pass all the way through the switch in either direction without any issues, but other times it would hang on one side of the switch or the other on a dead spot. And that actually has gotten a bit better, but still continues to this day with the layout. Troubleshooting for a different year, I think. Thankfully, you can give the engines a little nudge and they'll keep right on going. They're very small dead spots, just very odd and very frustrating. Finally, my new buildings began arriving. Shout out to all the eBay sellers who were shipping this stuff off the week before Christmas and actually getting it to me just in time. The houses were pre-assembled but would need additional painting and detailing. As you can see, the church was not built at all, and the storefront was just a basic shell. Lots of work to be done on those buildings. I also found this really awesome old in-scale station clock from the 1980s with actually an incandescent light bulb inside of that clock face. It had no instructions, so I just had to carefully test and guess for the wire hookups. Somehow I managed to not blow the light bulb out. I did cut one additional layer of the snow fabric to help hide the base flange for the tree stand. And then finally it was time to start preparing for the station shed extension, making sure that cars could ride up into it. And it was tricky because the base of this thing was really badly warped, and it was very easy for the side ladders or wheel wells to drag along the side of the station platforms. I also had to carefully drill a hole for the feeder wire for our power pack there. It feeds off the other side of the track, goes under the layout, and comes back up with that green wire to feed the siding. And then there was a unpowered additional siding that goes next to it. And you can see right here, the warped platform is really easy to have the train get stuck on, especially those side rods on the steam engine. Looking back though, I am very glad that I went ahead and got this shed onto the layout because Micah absolutely loves backing cars in and out of the shed. He is a proficient engineer. It's hilarious to watch him switching a model train at barely 3 years old. At this point, the water effects had dried enough that I could attempt an ice effect for on top. This was just acrylic paint, heavily watered down, probably 92% water or so. I just dabbed it right on top of the dried realistic water and then let it naturally kind of pool and create edges. From there, I would let it dry for about 15 or 20 minutes, and right when it was starting to get an edge to it, I would come back with the brush and dab more on top, which would then flow right back to that edge. And it did actually create, I think, a pretty awesome looking edged ice effect. Very simple and easy to do though. It is 7 days until Christmas, and I'm basically having to put scenery on hold while I work on hand detailing these new buildings. All of these individual parts were unpainted and stuck to their plastic holders and had to be cut off and then painted bit by bit. I had never done a model this small and detailed before in my entire life, so I feel like somebody with more experience could have knocked this stuff out a bit faster, or at least maybe would have been smart enough to not attempt it with a week left until Christmas. As I was working on this, I'm sitting there thinking, man, this would actually be pretty relaxing if it went for this ridiculous time crunch I've got going on here. What was I thinking? I also added additional detailing to these houses that I grabbed from eBay. They were 3D printed but pre-assembled and actually looked pretty awesome even with a rough initial paint job. I worked on cleaning up some of the porch railings that had missing paint spots, some of the porch decks that were missing paint. And from there, I would go back with a little bit of the flex paste and the acrylic white paint and add some more snow detailing on top. At this point, I had picked up so many random things that I kept finding more things in my supplies box that had to be painted, like these parking barriers, these green trash bins, these oil tanks, and all that on top of the other details for the general store. Here, I am doing some very basic weathering with just some acrylic paint and water is all this is. I would douse it on heavily, flip them over, let them dry, douse them again and flip them over, and so on and so forth. It is now only 6 days until Christmas, and everything is kind of going on at once here. I'm running the street lights through the board and testing electrical lines. I'm finally starting to cut and pre-prime the church, which is going to require just an absolutely insane amount of work. I think I probably spent a day and a half worth of full-time labor just working on this church. Again, not to be a completely broken record, but I really had no idea what I was doing. I really was in over my head here, but it was too late to turn back now. I finally gave up on the idea of having any of the snow fabric anywhere but the edges of the board and just slapped a bunch of plaster, I think actually the rest of my plaster, onto the layout to prepare the hills and fields for additional detailing. With such a short timeline, I knew that this was going to be my last chance to get any plaster down that had to have a couple days to dry. So I just stuck this stuff everywhere that I thought I might need to drill some trees or other details into the layout. I built up this hill here next to the shed as kind of an access maintenance road. I also expanded the parking lot to make room for some new sheds that I had picked up and to make room for more parked cars. The X there is where I was going to punch a hole through for the main lights for the Christmas tree. And next to the cabin in the woods here, I actually made a little bit of a snowy roadway with one of the model cars. Just some tracks heading out to the cabin. And there is our first test tree attached to the layout and looking awesome. At this point, it was about 3 o'clock in the morning, so I called it there for the night. 5 days until Christmas, and the church pieces, the many, many church pieces, have been primed with a base coat of gray spray paint and then a whitewash acrylic on top with some dry brushing after the first couple of layers had dried. Gives it a pretty nice weathered look almost by accident. That really wasn't intentional. For the bell tower, this model actually does not come with a bell, but I discovered almost by accident that an 8mm ship bell from Ship Models does fit it really, really well. So I picked one up from eBay, got here just in time, and popped it with some super glue onto a small divot that I glued to the top of the bell tower roof. With so little time remaining and so much left to do, I was working on all parts of this project at once. As glue was drying on the building models, I was working on testing the electrical. Had a mount set up here and a really roughly painted board for our switches, our toggle switches, and a basic toggle switch mount to hold the 3-way toggle for the signal light. I planned here to attach the entire control panel to the base of the layout with a hinge, which worked well, but I still haven't quite figured out how to avoid the wires pulling a bit as the hinge goes up and down if it gets bumped. Nothing's pulled loose yet, but I think I'm going to have to watch that for the future. This night was also the first and only time that I actually tested the layout underneath the Christmas tree once Micah had gone to bed. If nothing else, I felt justified in adding in those fairy lights around the edge because it really did help to brighten up the space there under the tree. It looks pretty awesome. But as this project kept getting more and more involved, it just got too detailed and too delicate to get put in the floor under the tree. I also found this old 1990s model train set sound system, just a very basic controller attached to some compact computer speakers with some truly awful, low quality looping sound effects attached to it. There's a reason that those standalone sound units with the controller have fallen out of favor in favor of sound and speakers directly on these little engines. Sound quality is just not great, but I figured my 3-year-old is going to love having a controller where he can just press a whistle button. And boy, was I right. 4 days until Christmas, and I'm really trying to get these buildings finished so that I can work on the layout as a whole. I almost broke the floor of the church there, as you can see, drilling a hole for the lighting system, but it's finally all coming together. I absolutely love this model kit, but man, did I pick a terrible option for having to build in a short time frame. All these window frames had to be layered piece by piece, and there's even short sticker sets to make the rooftop cap shingles. As you guys can see, the bell fits perfectly and looks really good. It's actually, I'm pretty sure, real brass. And it looks so good lit up from the inside with those stained glass inserts for the windows. Next up, it was time to try and fit the shed onto the extension piece. I had built the base up with a first layer of the flex paste. I'm using a toothpick right there, dipped in yellow paint, to help mark the underside of the building where I need to drill through it for the interior light. This right here is where the small detail on the terrain really got ridiculous. I wanted to have a little bit of grass poking through here and there where trees were clustered together to show how snowfall hadn't quite built up under the thickest parts of the trees and bushes. So I layered some different grass effects just here and there so that it would be peeking through the snow just a little bit at a few places on the layout. Looks a bit ridiculous without any of the bushes and trees on top, but here's some of the grass with the snow effect on top, and you guys can kind of see the effect that I'm going for. 3 days until Christmas, and I'm really trying to get some of these glued foliage on top of the grass layers so they have time to dry because I am soaking them in scenic cement glue. I'm trying to mix the colors up and create some different shapes, but what's cool about working with InScale is all it really takes is a couple of little fluffy piles of these spongy foliage detail bits with some of the powdered snow on top, and it creates a pretty convincing effect. They actually look like little bushes on top of these hills and down in the valleys. I also realized that the snow actually made a really good cover for the ballast on the track. Just adding a little bit in between the ties and the ballast that was already there gave the tracks a real nice icy frosted look. I also used a bit of the snow fluff to help cover the edges of the river and make a nice blend down to where the water starts with the ice effect on top. Again, as you guys can see at scale, that's a pretty convincing effect for the whole layout. Besides just blending the edges of the river, I also actually tumbled some of the snow powder down the hillsides and mountainsides to create some pretty realistic looking avalanche effects. It hurt a little bit to cover up some of the water details and some of the small stone details, but this fluffy snow on top just really helps to hide some of the small mistakes and really just blends everything together. And here's the ridiculous flex paste buildup that goes underneath the engine shed. I really didn't use much glue at all to hold this thing down. I figured all this flex paste ought to do it, and it does make for a pretty good looking snow as well. And here we go, guys. It is 11:30 p.m. with now less than 3 days until Christmas, and I'm doing a building test fit, which is looking really good. I'm feeling really justified in ditching those cheap Amazon buildings and going with some more scale correct ones. I'm also test fitting our first what I'll call hero trees here, the big oak trees, being twisted into shape. My wife helped with that. I realized I had gone a little bit overboard with all the underbrush and shrubbery there wasn't actually a lot of negative space left for just nice looking snow. So I pulled up some of those bushes that I put down so that I could have some areas of just plain snow, because it was getting a little bit noisy visually with so much of the small shrubbery details there all over the layout. As all of the glue was drying on all of this shrubbery and the flex paste was drying on the shed foundation there, I started working on making a couple of repairs to the shed itself, adding some wooden dowels to the roof section like it's been partially repaired. I would later stain those with some dark paint, but you can also see that most of the doors are missing from this shed, and those last two would eventually break off before Christmas morning. Just a really poor design for those door hinges. You can also see here that I am hand painting the base for our access road, which is going to lead down to the small shed over here at the very edge of the layout. Flex paste, not really recommended for sticking things down, but I was using so much of it, I figured this should work just fine, and it did. This is where the payoff really came in for all the plaster work that I did on the last night that I did do plaster. I had no annoying snow fluff to deal with drilling the initial holes to put our trees in. Anywhere that I had tried to do a hand drill for a tree in the snow fluff, it just pulled the fibers of the snow blanket right into the drill bit and didn't actually drill anything, as you would expect. So not having to deal with that and being able to pop these trees right into a nice hard layer of plaster saved me a ton of headache here with only a couple days left to go until Christmas. Also here, I'm working on cleaning up some of the stray grass out of the forest road. As each tree went into the layout, I also wanted to add a bit of flex paste where there wasn't a lot of plaster to hold them, especially here on the edge of the layout where there is still a lot of snow fluff underneath and not much of that plaster. And then a bit of flex paste on the trees themselves to simulate some snow buildup as the wind has been blowing, in my imagination, I guess. From there, I went across the entire layout, adding small pebbles and these cork rocks to help add just a bit of detail along with our fallen tree sticks there. I think I ended up using about 7 or 8 different tree types that I collected from all over the internet, but especially on eBay. Got these tall, rather bright green in-scale pine trees that I have actually added some darker fluff to, just to help them look a little more realistic. And then more of those twisted wire winter trees in both in and HO scale, because the in scale only bare wire trees were all a little bit small, and I wanted some larger, more realistic ones to complement the smaller ones. Along the way, I am, of course, continuously testing the turn radius of these long cars. Multiple times I had tree branches or rocks too close to the tracks or hanging over them too much, and cars were going to get caught on stuff. No matter what actually doesn't get done, at this point in my head, I'm just thinking to myself over and over again, the train has got to be able to go around in a circle on Christmas morning, even if stuff isn't totally perfect. And you guys can see here that the layering is really working well here. Starting with that base layer of flex paste, some of the sponge for the underbrush on top of that, then some of the small rocks, then the trees and the final snow fluff on top. It looks kind of cheap at first, but the more that you layer, the more kind of photorealistic it tends to look. It is just pretty tedious to do it bit by bit. I was having a lot of fun at this point, but just really stressed out about the schedule. At this point, it's about 4 o'clock in the morning, and I'm getting awfully close to pulling an all-nighter here with only 2 days until Christmas, but I'm on a roll, so I keep going. Really focusing on trying to get some of this last bit of scenic glue down wherever it needs to go, like right here on the gravel road that comes up out of the station parking lot. It's kind of the access road that goes over to the storage shed next to the engine shed. You guys can also see that I am completely burying both of the power cables here for the track, both the main power feed cable and the secondary teal cable that feeds power over to our siding past the switch. To help deal with the kind of uniform color of this gravel road, I used the last bit of my dyed glue here to add some oily spots to darken up bits and pieces of the gravel. A lot of this slope area and yard area was built up using the actual small stone pebbles and then this woodland scenic heavy ballast that came in just in time to actually get used. It's made of crushed acorns, I think, some kind of crushed nut, and then it's dyed and painted. It's very lightweight because of that, but it does tend to kind of stick to stuff before it's glued down, whereas using some of the real stones as a base kind of weights itself down. This thing was getting pretty heavy overall as a project though, with all the plaster on it, so wherever I could use some of the almond stones, I did so instead of the real stones. I was just imagining having to drag this thing out of my office and over to the living room in time for Christmas by myself in the middle of the night and dropping it on the wood floor. That was my nightmare. It is almost 5 o'clock in the morning here, and I'm about to fall asleep standing up. Gotta get some hours in so I can help chase the toddler in the morning. But I am so happy with how this is all kind of coming together at once. There's so much left to do, but so much of it is looking so good. One thing I just couldn't resist doing before I crashed though, we're going through and adding just a couple of road signs here and there. You can see a few along the track. Had to keep testing those because some of the cars were running into them on the curves. And there's some of my toothpicks holding spots for our lampposts. But yeah, the little signs really helped add some detail to both the track and the main road. I also put just a couple of our 3D printed fences in, and I figured those would look really good once the snow fluff gets added on top of those. Also, be warned where you leave things. After a long night of working, I sat my super glue right next to my saline nasal spray at my desk, and the next day came very close to grabbing the wrong tube. It is only 2 days until Christmas. I basically got to sleep in a little bit and then didn't get a chance to come back to the project until evening, but I got all of the decals onto our Fresh Market grocery store here, and it is looking really, really cool. I wanted to weather it some, but didn't have time to do so much, at least before Christmas. Just a few cuts on the decals here and there, but I would add some more weathering down the road. There are a lot of dead spots on the tracks right now from all of the glue that I had put down, so I was cleaning the tracks with this special cleaning car and rubbing alcohol. It's got scrubber pads on the bottom of the wheel trucks, and so I can basically have this thing clean the tops of the tracks for me as I keep working on the scenery. That worked out pretty well. $11:30 p.m. and 2 days until Christmas. A lot of the trees have gone in at this point, and that's going to be my main goal for the next night, is to get as much of the large scenery, like the trees and buildings, into their final positions. Even the road going through the forest is looking really, really good. I've got a couple of small log piles, quote unquote, made up of the sticks from the backyard. And a big mess of tree fluff all over everything that's going to have to get vacuumed up. As I was prepping for our snow fluff, it was time to put some of the final details down that needed to be underneath the snow. For the car garage, that included things like crates and barrels and this telephone booth, a few trash cans for around back, and some fencing that had come in one of the miscellaneous lots that I had picked up off of eBay. It was really hard during these last few days to keep my order of operations straight because, like I said earlier, there's just so many things that have to come together at the same time here. And with no time to step back and figure it out, I was constantly working on one thing and turning around and going, oh, wait, no, I got to work on this first. And then this has to be ready before the snow comes down over here. Or I got to paint some stain on this gravel before the cars go on top over here. Just a lot of back and forth trying to keep things straight. But for as simple as some of these props are, like the white fences that go up the side of the driveway right here, these little details really, really help to sell the overall effect. And you guys can see just how absolutely tiny some of these are as I'm trying to place them with my tweezers there. Probably the biggest thing I was sweating about was getting the lighting together, knowing that I really had none of the lights actually hooked up, and I hadn't even figured out how some of the lighting hubs were going to work. As you guys can see here, I got really lucky testing out some of these old lighted options like this clock right here with no instructions, just carefully testing it with resistors on the line so I wouldn't blow them out and figuring out which side was hot and which side was cold because it really wasn't intuitive. And that is what the underside of the layout looks like as I start punching the first of the electric through. and that is one of the control boards for our flashing crossing, stuck to the bottom with just a bit of Velcro. I didn't even realize that these lighting hubs existed until about a week and a half before these clips were taken. They were one of the last things to barely make it from Amazon in time for Christmas, but it lets you split a single 12-volt DC power source into terminals to run all of these different streetlights and other lights. Even as I'm working on getting some of the final snow detail on some of the areas like this small pine forest behind the house on the hill, in the back of my mind, the electric is really high priority for me because while the trees look good, most of the layout looks just fine with the amount of trees that I have down already. And I really wanted that lighting to be one of the main things that was done in time for Christmas morning. Having that toggle switch where Micah could just switch it on and off was going to be a big deal, I thought. I thought that was going to be one of the big visual effects. So even though I wanted to get this snow fluff down wherever I could with a few days left to go so that the glue and water could dry, that electric is really what is weighing down on my mind here. Oh yeah, it's also at this point about 4 a.m. already on Christmas Eve, so not a lot of time left for this stuff to really dry. As each area of trees, and you even see there some bushes that I put down, were glued into place, I went over each one and added custom snow fluff to help the trees all match. Even though some of these pine trees were already a Christmas style with a layer of snow on top of them. I also got pretty aggressive with dropping the snow onto the railroad tracks just because I thought it looked really neat. Made the tracks look pretty icy once the glue was wetted down and then locked down. Everything that I'm doing here with the snow along the tracks, though, is going to require constant testing and cleaning of the tracks. I'm also kind of laughing looking back at how I'm dropping the snow over this yard area next to the station that I worked so hard on to layer all of the different gravels and ballast, and now I'm just covering so much of it with snow. Looking back, if I would do anything different here, it would be to do a little bit less snowfall, just so that some of the details that I had put so much work into weren't completely covered up. Even then, I think layering the snow so heavily did make the whole thing look a lot more convincing. So if photorealism was my goal, or as close to it as possible, adding a lot of the snow on top probably was the right call, even if it did cover up a lot of the cool details of the ballast and gravel that made up areas like the yard next to the shed here. For areas like the parking lot behind the station, I'm trying to layer the snow and build it up in certain areas like it has snowed a couple of times over the last few days, some heavy, some not, and the areas have been plowed on and off. So that way parts of the station parking lot are pretty bare and you can actually see some of that gravel poking through. But boy, this stuff is making a mess. It is now 6:40 a.m. on Christmas Eve, and I am even more close to pulling in an accidental all-nighter, but I've got to get this snow and all this glue and water down as early as possible so that while I'm crashing and getting just a couple hours of sleep, this stuff has some time to dry, and also while we're going around and doing the usual Christmas Eve family events and traditions. My goal here for this early morning run on Christmas Eve was to get all of the snow glue that was going to be anywhere near the tracks complete before I went to sleep. And although it took until almost 7 a.m. to pull it off, I did get all of the track sections detailed with the snow before I went to bed. And here we go, 12:45 p.m. on Christmas Eve. Lunchtime was the first time that I got to go back to the office and really take a look at what I've been working on the night before. And to my surprise, the snow actually didn't hurt the track too much. Just a couple runs of cleaning and things were going quite well electrically all the way around. And just look how cool those crossing guard lights look as I hook up the first few elements to our DC power splitters. At this point, I'm like, even if I just set buildings along the traffic circle there in town, if I can just get the electrical working, this is going to look so awesome for Christmas morning. The only problem with that idea is that The electrical is going to require a lot of effort to get going. It was already a rat's nest, and I was maybe 20% of the way through. I had 3 different DC power splitters to run power to all these different elements. And worst of all, I had forgotten the wiring diagram that I had drawn for the colored green, yellow, and red signal lights. Those would end up being one of the few electrical items that were not ready in time for Christmas. I just could not, with my sleep-deprived brain, figure out that wiring diagram. But as you guys can see, basically all of the other electrical would be done in time for Christmas. Even though my interior LEDs were supposed to be a soft white, they were still way too cold in color temperature for my liking. So for some of the buildings, like our general store here, I made a custom diffuser out of some fluorescent spray paint that I had on hand and some bits of plastic, just to give it that warm Christmas time glow inside the store. Well worth it, it looked awesome. A lot of these buildings did need some additional support before I glued them down, so I would add bits of wooden dowel inside to help glue them down to the layout surface. With Micah asleep for Christmas night, I dragged this thing out to the living room finally, got it set up on sawhorses, and got back to work on the electrical. And that's what I spent most of my time on for, I guess, the first 5 or 6 hours of working on this thing on Christmas Eve. Running the electrical and trying to cover up some of the rat's nests with bits of cardboard and staples, as you can see there. It was a huge mess, but it was functional. Thankfully, my toggle switch worked great. I hadn't even had time to test that thing yet, and the effect of cutting all of the streetlights on was exactly what I was hoping for. It just looked so cool. A few things we're going to need some post-Christmas touch-up, like this house on the hill where the thin plastic is allowing too much light bleed through. It's kind of just glowing yellow all over. But as I'm taking a couple of these small detail shots here, I am just kind of amazed at how some of this stuff is actually coming together. After all this planning and all this work and all this lack of sleep, this was just so exciting to see it all coming together like this. After probably, I don't know, 7 hours of electrical, it's about 5 o'clock in the morning here, and it's time to put down some small details, like these 6 in-scale black bears that I hid here and there on the train set. There really wasn't a lot of pre-planning for the prop locations. I really was winging it here at 7 o'clock in the morning on Christmas Day for where things were going to go. Outside of maybe the pedestrians and the benches for the station, I didn't really know where things needed to go. I just put them where I thought they looked good. Here, I'm covering up one of the biggest issues that some model train sets have when they're trying to look realistic, and that's that the foundations of the buildings tend to float off of the base of the layout. So I'm covering up the foundations with some flex paste and also adding our first snow detailing to all of the rooftops. First, a layer of flex paste, building it up in the corners and alcoves and any area that snow might actually build up, knowing that I'm going to drop some of the snow fluff powder on top of that for the final look. As you guys can tell, I'm still working off of just what catches my eye. I'm bouncing from one part of this project to the next, with at this point only a couple hours to go until Micah is up and it's time for the big reveal. I'm feeling pretty good though about how things are going to look. I figure if he were to wake up right now, this thing looks awesome to his eyes. It's going to still be mind-blowing, even if it's going to bug me that some of the small details, like these fences that I'm meticulously installing, aren't finished yet. I grabbed my notepad and took about 2 minutes here to make a quick priority list of what I wanted to do next. I wanted to get as many of the small props down as possible in the next hour or so, and then I had to get the autos glued down, the cars along the roadways and in the parking lots. I really wanted those down before he woke up. The controller had been pretty neglected up to this point, but I remembered that I had picked up some of these brass bolt covers to add a little bit of finish detail to the controller board. 8:35 a.m. Christmas Day, and I'm really expecting Micah to be up at any point. As I was installing these picket fences here for the purple house in town, I remembered that I had not glued down any of the people yet, including Santa Claus, and so I would have to make time for that as soon as possible. I also kind of cringe looking back at this footage right here. I was so sleep deprived and in such a rush that as I'm adding the final snow detailing onto the town here, I left the power on. All of the LEDs are on right now, including that bare LED, all connected together through the underside of the layout. And I am pumping water from the mister all over this thing to set the glue for the snow powder. I got really, really lucky here that I did not short out all of that electric work that I had spent so much time on here at the 11th hour. That would have been absolutely crushing if I had blown out all my lights on Christmas morning. Thankfully though, all of the snow went down without any incidents. I added the last few sprinkles over the roadway, drilled the hole for the Christmas tree that my wife had made the night before on Christmas Eve in secret. And yeah, she really saved my bacon there because I would not have had time to build that thing out. I'm not sure if the park benches on the station platform count as figures, but that was next on my last minute to-do list, was to get the benches down and then the individual figures that are going to go along with them. These right here are just from a bulk pack from Amazon. They're really roughly painted, but you get like 100 figures for 12 bucks or 13 bucks, and they're plenty detailed enough to fill out a crowd, or in this case, a station. I would go back after Christmas and before recording the final hero shots for this video and add some smaller packs of higher end figures from a few companies in Germany and elsewhere that are known for some really nicely painted ones. At 9:40 a.m. on Christmas Day, I am dying for a cup of coffee, almost literally, but I'm actually done putting down the figures and I'm putting the final hot glue on the cars. This was a good idea because at first Micah didn't quite understand that this was a model train set and the cars aren't supposed to move. He did get the tow truck loose, and if you look close at some of the final footage at the start of the video, you can see a tire scrape mark where he wanted to drive the tow truck and rescue that broken down bus. That's the amazing part for me though, is that as detailed and delicate as this thing is, he has been so good with it. The only thing that has happened to this train set in the months now that it has been up is he accidentally broke the bell off the church tower because he was so convinced that it would ring. He was so sad when it did not. And that was it. I powered everything up, ran a couple more test circuits of the track, and it was 10 o'clock in the morning, and somehow this kid had not woke up yet. So I went to go get him to reveal his train set. And let me tell you guys, the reaction of him when he saw it was, oh, it was so worth it. It was absolutely priceless. He was carrying his bunny and his golden Polar Express ticket that I had got him, and he dropped it all on the floor when he saw it. It was great.
What is that? What do you see in there?
For the fence.
Is there a Polar Express in there?
I think that. No.
Okay, get to it just a little bit. And watch. You made it move. Here it comes. Watch, it's gonna turn the light on too.
I see chaos.
This right here is the whistle. It's got sound effects. Oh, yep.
In the tunnel.
In the tunnel?
I see it. I see it. I just mean guy house. I mean guy house.
A mean guy lives there?
Uh-huh.
He's got a nice house.
Yeah. Oh, I mean guy building nice house.
He built a nice house.
After so many hours spent on this project and so many late nights, I swear it took me a couple of weeks to feel human again. I barely remember Christmas Day at all after that. I was pretty much done for. But after a couple of days had gone by, I was ready to get cracking on the stuff that had not gotten done in time for Christmas. Some of those unfinished parts included painting the inside of the house on the hill black to help with the light bleed, and installing these absolutely tiny micro LEDs with a warm color as front porch lights, because That part of the layout with the house on the hill was very, very dark compared to the rest of the layout that had streetlights. I also added one as a back porch light, and now that part of the layout has some great looking light effects going on as well. I was also finally able to sit down and figure out the wiring diagram again for the signal lights, and once one of them was hooked up, I just ran T-splitters off of those 4 wires to power the other 2 signals so that they all match. You can also see that we didn't make it 2 weeks past Christmas before I ordered the full-on digital controller so we could control all of the sound effects for the engine and also run multiple engines on it if we wanted to. I also realized that I had forgotten to add the ice effect to the frozen pond, which is kind of important for a pond that I wanted to be frozen. So I went through with the same effect and technique and added that ice on top with a watered down acrylic white paint. To help not completely wear out the Mikado steam engine, I also picked up a 1950s, I think this is an F unit diesel engine, also on a appropriately Northern Railroad name for Northern Pacific there. This would also pull some of the freight cars that I had picked up along the way, including a freight car that Micah's uncle had given him for Christmas. Once he learned that he was going to have a train set under the tree, his uncle showed up the day after Christmas with a in-scale hopper car there for him full of coal, which was pretty awesome. So we had a freight train on hand within a couple of weeks to just take some of the runtime off that steam engine. Some of the freight cars that I had picked up along the way were pretty fun, including a Jack Frost cane sugar tanker car to fit the Christmas theme. Some of the cars you've seen in clips in this video, Micah won't get until next Christmas though. Some of this stuff just wasn't finished in time, and I figured it would make great gifts for next year. One of those project cars is going to be a Christmas tree transportation car. I had this die-cast actual metal little blue tractor here and a few extra pine trees left over. So I decided to take this cheap $5 flat car and turn it into a full-on Christmas tree delivery car. Tying knots with that tiny thread with tweezers underneath the car was a nightmare, but I also used some of those concrete stopper ties there for the tractor. And here's the actual glue you're supposed to use for gluing down figures. It's very, very tacky, but technically you can remove decorative items from that glue without destroying those decorations like you would with super glue. I also picked up a snowplow car for a later Christmas gift for next year, and then here's some of those higher end figures going down as a final detail pass for the layout. 3 of those hikers have now been hidden around, and I'm hoping to add a full campsite hidden somewhere in the forest for next year. A handful of detail models also arrived after Christmas. I either ordered them too late or didn't think of them until after we were already past Christmas. But some of those models included things like our herds of reindeer, which I have placed around the layout as if it were the Polar Express movie. Also some small detail objects like piles of railroad ties hidden along the railroad tracks, and even a couple more vehicles for the main road, like a very appropriate Coca-Cola truck and a camper heading out for some winter camping from downtown. And there you have it, guys. With the completion of this video, which has also taken a ton more time than I expected, I'm calling this project complete for the year. I'd like to add a few more things maybe each year as a fun family tradition, add a few hidden details as each Christmas season rolls around, but I'm calling it for now. Time to pack it away finally, and we'll see it again next Christmas. But if you guys enjoyed this video, I don't want to just spam you with more model videos if I actually end up doing more. So I have opened a second channel, the Immersion Depot. There's a theme here, where you guys are going to be able to subscribe and see any videos like this that I post in the future. I am planning on at least one more before next Christmas, which is going to be kind of like the fireplace videos, you know, the 1 hour fireplace loops, but it's going to be a 1 hour cinematic loop of this train set that you can run as a background on your TV. Probably more to come on that channel too. Not sure what the exact plans are just yet. I just wanted to go ahead and get it set up before I posted this video on my channel and spammed you all with it. Either way, I hope you guys all enjoyed. I know that I definitely had way too much fun with this project. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.